All right. Welcome to those watching on YouTube to another episode of the Speedrun. We are almost at 1,000. And this time we have the black pieces against Eren Yılmaz from Turkey and B3. Okay, so this is a move that I was not expecting that we would face until we're a bit higher rated. There's many things that we can play against B3, but the sort of most principled response, as you probably know, is E5. E5 is the business move. That's the move you make to fight for an advantage with black. B3 is called the Nimzowitsch-Larsen opening. I'll talk a little bit about it after the game. I'm kind of curious what setup our opponent chooses, because at this level, a lot of people, they go B3 and then they go G3. And then, look at that timing. And then they basically play what's called a hippo setup, where you fianchetto both of your bishops, and then you make these slots in the center for both of your knights. And we faced that in earlier speedruns. It's not an opening that I recommend to newer chess players or to more advanced chess players for that matter. Of course, our response as against any such opening is to occupy the center and then support it with our pieces. This is the sort of standard formula for fighting against any flank openings of this nature. The one thing to remember is that it's not a contest of how many pawns we can put in our center. So I think some newer players in this type of situation tend to go F5 and then C5 and try to put as many pawns as possible in the center. And F5 is not a terrible move, but it's also kind of unnecessary. The emphasis should be on occupying a sufficient chunk of the center, which we've already done. And then the second priority should be to bring our pieces out and make sure that that center is well defended so that we don't overextend ourselves. So my inclination in such a position is to emphasize piece development rather than to, continue pushing our pawns forward, because we might end up biting off more than we can chew. So the simplest option here is just to play knight f6 or knight c6, but I'm going to put together a setup that I've displayed in previous speedruns, where instead of developing the other knight to c6, we actually put a pawn on c6. We actually put a pawn on c6. Why do we put a pawn on c6 in this instance, and doesn't that hamper the development of our knight? These are questions that you should be asking yourself. The reason, okay, we can even play c6 here. We can also bring the dark squared bishop out to d6. But let's start with the move c6. The answer to the first question is that we are anticipating that white fianchettos their bishop, which our opponent already did. And now the bishop is biting on granite, which is a phrase that I use too much. But just look at how this bishop is staring at the d5 pawn, which is just beautifully defended by this pawn chain. It's very, very hard for white to break down this pawn chain. And so the bishop on g2 is kind of useless. As far as the second question goes, the knight has an alternative option of development, which is to go through d7. And so you might say, but when the knight gets to d7, doesn't it hamper the development of the light squared bishop? And here it's very, very useful to know a typical knight maneuver. If you're a Ruy Lopez player, or if you've watched previous speedruns, this maneuver should be kind of at the top of your mind, which is that the knight on d7 doesn't have to stay there forever. Oftentimes it jumps back to f8 and then moves up to g6, which is a very useful square. That knight can potentially jump to h4 or f4 if this pawn is eventually ejected from g3. And of course, we reopen the diagonal for the light squared bishop. But before we do any of that, let's castle kingside, get our king to safety. The order of operations here is not particularly important. There's going to be a lot of good moves on every turn. So you shouldn't be watching this and asking yourself, like, oh, why is he not playing knight b to d7 first? Or why is he not playing rook to e8 first? It really does not matter. This is not an opening where the armies are in contact with each other. And so the significance of any individual move is going to be pretty minimal. One move that I really like to play in these types of positions, and we can even play it now, is a5. Now, this is another one of those moves that you can go without. It's not like you have to play a5, but it's a good idea to clamp down on the queen side, because one of the typical plans of the hippo is for white to eventually expand on the queen side with b4, and then c4. That's sort of one of the textbook plans that is recommended for white. By playing a5, we're grabbing some space, and we're making it very, very difficult for white in the future to expand with b4. We don't need to defend this pawn just yet. I mean, we will if white plays knight f3, but I'm assuming that our opponent is going to continue with the hippo setup and play e3. Another thing that you should remember is that this is not an opening that you can refute easily in a couple of moves. So your mindset here should not be, I have to punish this in 15 moves. That's not possible. The hippo is actually a pretty solid opening. And this is often misunderstood. Players often try to win in like 5 seconds. That's not realistic. You still have to kind of follow the rules of development. And although black has the advantage here, it's not like we're winning and should be looking for some sort of knockout blow. But knight c3 is a bad move. This move is incongruent with this setup. And our opponent is inviting us to grab more space in the center and pose a very awkward dilemma to white. What move am I kind of heavily implying here? Well, of course, it's d4. There's no reason that we shouldn't play d4. Ask this knight some questions, grab more space in the center, and this is also why we put the pawn on c6. Now the light squared bishop is still relatively passive, and our opponent decides to blunder a knight. Knight to a4 is a pretty standard reaction in a lot of openings, but this is not one of them. And of course, this is just a classic knight blunder. This move is very, very often missed on both sides of the board. And of course, it's the move b5. And after the game, I'll show you that even GMs often forget about this particular resource. For some reason, is a blind spot for a lot of players. And that's it. The game is over. I said I didn't expect to win in 15 moves. I said I expected to win in 10. That's, of course, what I meant. Yeah, so after the game, I'll show you what my intended response would have been to knight e4. Essentially, we would have traded on e4, which would have created another very awkward situation for white, because white probably would have recaptured with the bishop, and a bishop on e4 in this type of position is not a blessing, but much more of a curse, as I'll talk about after the game. Now, we could probably go d takes e3, but that would actually liberate the knight. So be very careful if you have this type of situation. Remember, the d4 pawn is actually controlling the c3 square, so it's not worth playing any games here. Let's just take the knight and cash in our chips, so to speak. Also, if white plays e takes d4, this is actually going to help us because white's king is stuck in the center, and this is just total self-destruction. We will happily give up the d-pawn in return for opening the e-file, so our opponent smartly doesn't do that. But at this point, we can already play d takes e3 and discharge the central tension. In addition, we're creating a very attackable target on e3. But before we proceed to attacking it, let's go a takes b3 and just kind of clear up the tension on the queen side as well. This move also has the benefit of, after c takes b3, creating another potential target, actually two potential targets, because then d3, b3, and e3 are all going to be very attackable targets. But I'm especially looking at this e3 pawn. Okay, for some reason, our opponent doesn't recapture. So in that case, thank you very much. Let's take another pawn. And now it's a good idea to identify the target that we want to attack and then go ahead and attack it. So the e3 pawn I've pointed out as the kind of juiciest target in white's position because it's not currently defended. And there is a very nice way that we can attack e3. Some of you might think it's queen b6, but I would hesitate in this situation to move the queen away from the center, because we're kind of allowing rook takes f6. And after queen b6, white could just block the diagonal with d4. So if possible, I'd prefer to do this with minor pieces. Bishop c5 blunders the bishop. That's not possible. But knight to d5 is an excellent move. We're also getting our money's worth from this c6 pawn, which now doubles as a support for the knight. So this is what knights are really good at, is attacking specific targets. And as a result of this move, we've also opened up new vistas for our queen. Queen to g5 is going to be a much nicer way of attacking this pawn or the queen because this diagonal cannot be intercepted. The f4 square is under our control. Now notice that I'm not currently developing the queen side because we're up a piece and there's absolutely no hurry to complete our development at the current moment. White is not threatening anything, and white's position continues to collapse. Let's take this pawn, forking the queen, the rook, and potentially even the bishop, which we actually might capture. The bishop is a very valuable piece here. So there are many situations where rather than taking the rook, we would instead take this bishop to just fully take the teeth out of white's position. Okay, queen to d2. So a very pleasant choice here between taking the rook and taking the bishop, but I'm actually much more inclined to take the bishop in this situation. And I think a good way to understand the rationale behind this move is that there is kind of the law of diminishing returns applies very nicely to material. Like winning the first pawn is really, really significant. winning that first minor piece is huge. Once you're already up a minor piece, the impact of winning a second minor piece or an exchange is oftentimes going to be pretty minimal. You've already won the material that you need to win in order to win the game. And so oftentimes your priorities are going to shift. Rather than taking that extra bit of material, doing something like what we just did, also known as eliminating White's kind of main attacker and ensuring that this king is going to be vulnerable for the rest of the game, that's going to be more important. If the material was equal, we probably would have grabbed the rook and gone up in exchange. So just think about that and if that makes sense to you, because that's a very, very important concept. Okay, let's make more moves and say less words. Okay, there's many ways to play this position. I don't see a reason that we can't just play e takes d4, clearing up the central tension. Now that White's king is so vulnerable, it's a good idea to open up the center. A lot of you wouldn't play this move because after queen takes d4, White is threatening checkmate. But remember, the fact that checkmate is threatened does not make a move bad. You should not be scared of mate threats per se, especially when they're very easy to defend against. Queen takes d4, we just play f6. It's the same principle as the move c6. We're just blunting White's battery, and there's no further danger to our king. So knight takes d4. I'm looking at the knight, I'm looking at the bishop, and I'm looking at the queen on d2. White's pieces in the center are extremely vulnerable. So does that mean we should go c5 here? Well, c5 is a little bit premature because it allows the knight to jump into b5. But maybe we can set up the move c5. How can we set this up? We can play bishop a6. Some of you are recommending that's a good move. But I really like this move bishop e5. Just putting the bishop on the long diagonal, opening up an X-ray against White's queen. And now c5 is a huge threat. So this move kind of functions in two ways. First of all, we're creating a tactical threat. Second of all, we're setting up potential trades which are going to favor us because we're up a lot of material. We're up a bishop and 2 pawns, I think. We're also setting up the potential for queen d5 check. Okay, White is offering us another minor piece. We'll take it. Of course, if your opponent is just handing out pieces, then you should take them. Okay, rook d1. Here there are two options. There's the move c5, and there's bishop takes b2, which also hits the queen. Let's go for the latter because it also prepares bishop b7 check, and that is how we're going to win the game. We're going to create a devastating battery on the long diagonal, and hopefully that'll lead pretty quickly to checkmate. Yeah, as a matter of fact, we can deliver an intermediate check on b7. You don't have to worry about White blocking this check because White literally has no light square control. If we wanted to be super fancy, we could have technically played queen d5, but there's no reason to, go for the brilliancy prize when you can just recapture the piece. Rook to g1. Our opponent is adopting a fully defensive posture. Let's go rook e8. There's many, many ways to win this game, but the simplest is to use open files and use our extra pieces. And of course, our opponent has just allowed the rook to infiltrate e2. Now it's all done. White has to give away all of their pieces. Yeah, rook g2, rook takes g2. And while we don't actually have forced mate there, we can just win White's queen and win the game shortly thereafter. Hopefully White resigns. Okay. Yeah, this is rook takes g2. This is a windmill. The most accurate way to win the queen here is to first take the pawn using the windmill technique because the king has to keep toggling between h2 and h1. That's the basic principle, which means that we can take whatever is available to capture while maintaining this mechanism. Now that we have eliminated the pawn, we move one square to the right and pick up the entire queen without giving away this rook. Now we're threatening checkmate in 2. Queen g5, king h2, and either queen g2 or rook f2 is going to be checkmate. Okay, GG. So obviously a large part of the game was spent in like a completely winning position, and that might be a little bit boring for you, but nonetheless, I think it's a good idea to make sure that your technique is accurate because when we get to higher levels, that's going to become super important. So first of all, before we do anything else, I want to convince you that even very strong players can miss this kind of concept with b4 or g4 trapping the knight. It's just one of those typical blind spots. And here's a good illustration. Leko versus Elvist, 1996 is a rapid game, but it's game in 30. It's not like they're playing bullet. And watch this. e4, g6, d4, bishop g7. So this actually starts out as a modern, but yeah, so c5. Okay, whatever. Pretty standard position. Believe it or not, black resigns in another 3 moves. White plays h3 to stop bishop g4. Elvis plays knight c6, d5, and knight a5. Now, this is not the blunder. This is the interesting part. This is not the blunder. Here, if white plays b4, and after a cb, who can tell me what black's best move is? And this is a trick question, actually. I know a lot of you are going to say one particular move, but it's not actually the best. Remember that in most middle games, two pieces for a rook is pretty bad for the side of the rook. So the best move is not knight takes d5 or knight takes d4 because it offers an additional piece. We can take one piece and then we can take the other one. The best move is just to move the knight back to d7. And it's the same effect. You're hitting the rook. And you might say, well, what if white tries to intercept the diagonal? Well, for one thing, black can just play knight takes e5. And no matter what white puts on the diagonal, it's going to be undefended. So that's a bad move because the bishop's undefended. By the same token, knight c3, the knight is undefended. So white essentially has to give up the exchange. It doesn't win for black. I mean, the game continues. White can try bishop h6. The game goes on. But it's quite bad for white. So Leko plays rook e1, and Elvis accidentally plays e5. He forgets completely about b4. And he blocks in his own bishop. Leko plays b4, and black resigns because there's no longer the same defensive mechanism. This is just one game that came to mind. I'm sure there are many others. So these types of things can be missed even by super strong players. Yeah, pretty anticlimactic ending to the game. Let's go back to the speedrun. Okay, so in this game we faced b3. Of course, g3 is the hippo where white double fianchettos. If white wants to play the traditional Nimzowitsch-Larsen, then you play bishop b2. We would have responded with knight c6. And here, the older move is e3. And now the main line continues knight f6, bishop to b5. While the newer move is knight f3 in this position. This is the kind of modern treatment where you're provoking black into playing e4 and carving out this d4 square for the knight. This line is pretty innocuous, and the simple approach is just to play knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, d5. It's equal, but I used to play this with white, and if black is not careful, white can definitely put some pressure on black's position after c4. So it's usually a better idea after knight f3 to play a more conservative move like d6, and then just essentially play the King's Indian setup with g6 on the next move. White can play d4 here, but black could even respond with e4 and d5, and this is completely fine. b3 is not a move that you play to, contend for an opening advantage. It used to be a move that you would play to get out of theory, but now the theory in this opening, as in all openings, is extremely advanced. So there's no longer such a thing as let me play some sideline to take my opponent out of prep. At a high level, that doesn't really exist. At the lower levels, you should be aware of these moves as well. So g3, yeah, we claim the center. So one important takeaway is prioritize piece development over just like blindly putting pawns in the center. And c6, this is a really, really good setup. And you see this type of move against most fianchetto openings. Like, for example, from the white side, if you face the perk, right? If you face the perk. One of Gata Kamsky's favorite responses to the perk is to play bishop d3 here. And after g6 to play c3. This very interesting setup. It's exactly the same principle. You're fighting against the influence of this bishop on g7 by building this pawn chain, and the knight is going to get developed to d2. All right, so just a good setup to keep in your pocket. Yeah, c6. So the trouble started for white when they played knight c3. Of course, the proper way to play this is e3 and then knight e2 and knight d2. We would have probably played rook e8, and as I indicated, we would have shuttled the knight around to g6. And now one good plan involves getting the bishop out, going queen to d7, starting to put pressure on this h3 pawn. And eventually we could even send our own h pawn down. Even though we've castled to the king side, white is so passive here that we can kind of get away with playing h5 and slightly weakening our king side. I've had previous Hippo games that you can take a look at. I'm not going to delve too deeply into this setup. I want to talk briefly about why knight e4 is an awkward move for white. So we would have captured on e4. Now, d takes e4 is just stupid because it ruins the pawn structure. Our opponent would have played bishop e4. And this is a super instructive moment. I'm positive that most of you watching are itching to play f5. F5 is not a bad move, but it allows the bishop to drop back to its sort of home base. And f5 is not necessarily a useful move in these positions because it does block in the bishop, and you can try to play f4 and kind of ram the king side open, but white's not going to allow that to happen. And now you've created this big outpost on e4 that white can use for their knight, kind of getting around through f3 and d2. So the best move is actually knight d7. And the reason the bishop is such an awkward piece is because white can never play knight f3. Now, of course, you have f5 trapping the bishop. So in order to bring the knight out, white has to waste another tempo bringing the bishop back. Now, for example, we can get our knight to a proper square, and only now white can play knight f3. And here we have a lot of ways that we can handle the position. We can centralize the knight, and then we can play an improving move like rook e8, and we can basically do the same thing that I indicated with bishop f5 and queen d7. We are completely clamping down on this c and e pawn, so white can never really go c3, white can never really go e3. White is stuck with really, really bad bishops. White is just positionally much worse. We don't want to go knight c3 in this position, by the way, for several reasons, one of which is that this is just a bad trade for us because we're going to end up losing this pawn. So just because you have an outpost doesn't mean that you should automatically put a piece there. Yeah, bishop f5, queen d7, or bishop e6, queen d7 is good. Rook e8. At some point, you can play a4. Of course, you shouldn't rush a4 because it allows b4. Although one typical idea involves basically playing a4 and then c5 and carving out a kind of avenue of attack on the queen side. Here, it doesn't work because you're going to blunder the e-pawn, but it is a typical idea as well in these types of positions. This is not winning. No. Black is not winning. I would say it's about +1, maybe a little bit less than that. It's a very pleasant advantage, but it's just a very hard position for white to play. And that's basically that. Yeah, obviously knight a4, b5, and the game is over. Okay, our opponent also didn't recapture our pawns, which exacerbated the situation. And here, just remember, once you've already won that decisive amount of material, taking more material is not always your top priority. It's kind of a case-by-case thing. And that's that. Any questions? Pretty simple, cut and dry game. We can get another one in. Okay, let's go. Another black game against Maksud 1989. e4, we are playing the Sicilian, and d4. So we're facing the Smith-Morra. No, queen takes d4. Pretty common line at this level. Obviously not a particularly good opening. The kind of sister opening to this one is the center game, which is e4, e5, d4. And against e5, it's still not a very good opening, but at least it has some sense to it. This is just really bad. So obviously our response, first of all, is to play knight c6 and chase the queen. And now we're simply going for rapid development, trying to punish white for wasting 2 tempi in the opening. Next step is to bring out the other knight and hit the pawn. And here is a good moment to pause and decide where we want to bring out this bishop, because if you're a dragon player, you might be inclined to play g6. If you're a knight or player, you might be inclined to play d6, but there is a way to maximize our initiative here, which is neither of those moves. Where do we want this bishop on f8? If you could lift it and put it on any square, where would you put this bishop? Well, you would probably put it on b4, because that way you would be attacking the e4 pawn. So how do we do that? Do we play the move e5? Well, e5 is positionally weakening. Why do we give white this outpost on d5? So instead, a good idea is to play e6. And again, you should remember that in chess, a lot of times a move is good, even though it has drawbacks. Does e6 have a drawback to it? Yes. The bishop on c8 is going to complain a little bit. Like, what about this bishop? But just because a move obstructs a piece doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't play it. We're going to figure out arrangements for this bishop later in the game. We could play b6, bishop b7, and we could play d6, bishop d7. Not every piece needs to be climbing Mount Everest at all given times. On the other hand, after bishop b4, white is already facing very significant problems with this e4 pawn, and very significant problems with this bishop on b5 that is super misplaced. Okay, so now we get to the big question. Do we play bishop takes c3 or not? Bishop c3, and knight takes e4. Of course, in that position, you should notice that white has bishop takes g7. So, although after bishop takes g7, we can play queen a5 check. So there's a little calculation to do there. So takes. Do we have a move in that position? Queen a5 check, white plays c3. And at the end of the line, the rook on h8 is going to be hanging. And if you play rook to g8, white is able to bail out with bishop takes c6. Not necessary. Probably, according to the engine, it's good for black. Why? Why do we even bother with this? Just castle. Bishop takes c6. Okay, so in this case, there's no reason not to take toward the center, especially because we've opened up a nice little vista for the bishop on a6. And now that white is encouraging us, well, actually, that's crazy, but there is a tactic. Takes, knight takes e4. There's a crazy tactic in that position, which is bishop takes g7. Definitely our opponent is not intending to go down this path, but bishop g7, king g7, white can pick up the knight with queen g4 check. But I think we have an intermezzo of our own in that line, so let's do it. Bishop takes c3, and knight takes c4. Queen e2, yeah, that's a more typical move for this level. That is just a very bad move because of knight takes c3, completely ruining white's pawn structure. And now we can shift to our next priority, which is that this bishop on c8 needs to be developed. The ideal square is a6. So you might come up with the move a5, preparing bishop a6, but there is a better way to prepare bishop a6. Just checking off multiple items. We might as well prepare bishop a6 while activating our queen. So queen a5 is a very natural and very good move. Now we can bring the bishop out to a6, making it difficult for white to castle. We're not worried about this pawn because we take c3 with a fork. Even if we didn't have queen takes c3, queen takes d7 is not scary because the queen is likely to get trapped there. Yeah, good job. People were indicating queen a5 pretty quickly. Yeah, white's in huge. Knight f3. So knight f3 doesn't address the problem of castling because now our bishop is uncontested on this diagonal, which gives us a little bit of time. What do we use this time to do? There's many good moves in this position, but I think we should continue getting our pieces into the game. That's just a safe bet. The more advanced players among you might notice that c4 is a possibility for white on the next move, c4. And c4 is good because it prepares castle's kingside, and it offers an exchange of queens. Now, we're up a pawn, so any endgame here is going to be pretty overwhelmingly better for black. But if you want to avoid the queen trade, you can also play this very classy move, bishop c4, just physically putting a bishop on that square. On the other hand, bishop c4 is kind of slow, and the bishop itself on c4 is going to be vulnerable, for instance, to a move like queen to d4. So I'm not going to bother with that. Let's go rook b8. If white plays c4, we can just trade queens and play a winning endgame. Knight d4. Okay, so this move does not contain any threats. We can just proceed with our plan. I don't see a reason why we shouldn't infiltrate with the rook to b2. Just optimizing, maximizing the activity of our pieces. Knight b3. Okay, so lots of good squares for our queen. I really like the check on e5 because this keeps the ball rolling and it's a tempo move. If white blocks with a queen, again, we have several options. We can trade and then take on c2 with a subsequent fork on another pawn. So at least we'll be 3 pawns up in that endgame. Likewise, queen e3, we can play queen to b5, building the battery. But again, the emphasis on this speedrun is simple chess, and you see a completely winning endgame, you go for it. There's no reason to shy away from an endgame like this where we're completely winning. It's not the glamorous solution, but it's the simplest option that's going to win you the game the fastest. Let's take another pawn. You cannot castle out of check. It's illegal. No, that's a good question, by the way, for new. You cannot castle in this. Well, also, oh yeah, castle's queen side would be legal, but no, you cannot castle out of check. It's illegal. c4. Finally, white closes down the diagonal, but it's a little bit too late. What is the approach in these types of positions? Well, the easiest thing to do is to identify pieces that are not playing to the fullest of their ability, and then to involve them. So the move that's kind of begging to be played is rook to b8. But this move is also predicated on a tactic. If white had gone knight c5, which might be a little bit scary to some of you, you should notice that you're controlling the second rank, so ladder mates are going to be super common. After knight c5, you have bishop takes c4, which is a tactic that kind of you should spot intuitively, deflecting the rook from the first rank. And if white takes, then we have rook b1 checkmate. Okay, king f1. So white is attacking the rook. Let's be vigilant. Now an important moment, actually. Where would you put this rook? Remember that knight c5, you want to have the response bishop takes c4, which means that you want this rook controlling the second rank, and you want this rook to have the access to b1. Therefore, rook a2 is a more accurate move than rook b2. Bingo. Now we can take, and white is unable to recapture. So just smooth, clean technique comes a very, very long way toward shortening the length of these games. Yeah, our opponent is figuring out that they can't take on c4. If my opponent had LOO at the end of his name, I would have been a little bit more scared. Okay, so we have checkmate in just a couple of moves here. We want to encourage white to take on c4. How do we encourage white to do that? Well, we do that by threatening a checkmate. The king is currently out of squares. So a pretty obvious move is rook b to b2, doubling rooks on the second rank, which is good intrinsically, but also threatening checkmate on g2, which is completely unstoppable. So white basically has to take the bishop, and then we checkmate with rook a1 or rook b1. Easy clap. Easy clap. Checkmate. Okay, another simple game, but there were some interesting complications that we avoided. And there was really one interesting tactical moment. Yeah, so d4 is not a bad move if white follows it up with a Smith-Morra or even knight f3. Knight f3, by the way, you should not play e5 here, which is a very tempting move because knight e5 runs into queen a5 check. But at a higher level, e5 is considered to be a bad move. Does anybody know why? Why is e5 considered to be inaccurate here? It's a positional reason. It's a positional reason. c3. Yeah, here white basically plays the Smith-Morra move. And the point is that after the trade, black is a pawn up, but you have this massive hole on d5. And you have a big development advantage for white, so this is a super unappealing position. So here you just go d6. You allow white to recapture the pawn, and you transition back into the knight or whatever Sicilian you play. So c3 is the Smith-Morra. I do not recommend accepting it. I recommend forcing white to play the Alapin with knight f6. e5, knight d5, cd is very typical. So yeah, so queen d4, knight c6, knight f6, and white is already in some trouble. Knight c3, e6, preparing bishop b4. Probably white should play a3. And here we can grab control of the center with d5. This is one of several good moves. We can also play bishop c5 and prepare it to pressure f2. Actually, bishop c5 is a great move because after knight f3, knight g4, white literally cannot defend this pawn. White can play bishop e3, but this is just absolute misery. But bishop b5 makes things even worse. Bishop to b4, bishop to d2. And here, yeah, bishop c3, knight e4. Maybe if I was playing another GM, I would spend 30 minutes looking at this position. But what I saw in this game is that queen a5 check is not as good as it looks. Because after c3, you can take the bishop, but then you drop the rook in the corner and you're down in exchange. And if you play rook to g8, both bishops are hanging, but white can capture the knight, thereby bailing out bc. And now white can move the other bishop back. And funnily enough, if you play rook takes g2, LPDO, queen f3 forks the rook and the knight. So I saw this variation and decided, why bother? Maybe there is a move here, maybe queen h4, although it runs into g3. Maybe rook g8 immediately is good for black. I have no doubt that black is better. No doubt at all. Maybe queen b6, although here again, queen e2, and it's not clear. But because we have such a good position to begin with, you have to be practical and save time, and that's why I decided to castle. So bishop c6 bc is another favorable trade for us. Probably the best move for white was e5. And e5 can be met with knight d5. Yeah, knight d5 is a great response. And if knight takes d5, obviously we don't give up the bishop. We take on d2 first, then we play c takes d5, getting us a very nice central clamp. And then we can play bishop a6 just like in the game, preventing white from castling kingside. If white castles queenside, white's castling into an attack because both the b and the c files are open. So we can very easily marshal our forces on the queen side and start creating threats, whereas white has nothing going on the other side of the board. So that's the basic concept here. There was a question, queen g5 after queen f3. So it was in the other line, someone was asking, after queen f3, so it's check, here. Queen g5, yeah, that's a great point. You do have queen g5. Because that attacks the knight and threatens queen d2. Although even here, knight h3, check, king f1. Now the rook is hanging again. Maybe the computer can make it work, but the point is it's unnecessary. The risk to reward ratio just doesn't make it worth it. Okay, so our opponent hung the pawn. And here there was this crazy idea, bishop takes g7. King takes g7 and queen g4. And you should be familiar with this type of tactic where a minor piece is sacrificed to force the king onto a more vulnerable square. And then the piece is recovered by checking the king and then an undefended minor piece. This type of tactic is very widespread. One opening trap that comes to mind in the Slav, there is a very famous opening trap where basically it's this. Yeah, e4. This is an old line, and then takes. In this position, I think the best move is f5. If black plays e5 in this position, you fall victim to a very similar trap. de5, knight e5, knight e5, bishop e5. What is white's best move in this position? What is white's best move in this position? The wrong answer is queen h5, thinking that you're forking the bishop and the pawn. Queen h5 is wrong because black can intercept with f5. The right answer is what we're talking about, bishop h7. It's not a Greek gift. This is just a tactic. It happens to be h7. White wins the bishop back and is up a full clean extra pawn. But just something to be aware of this type of tactic. Here, after king g7, queen g4, yes, knight g5 exists, but white picks up the knight with h4. And maybe you can go h6 and you can claim a pawn for the piece, but I was planning a different kind of desperado move. The logic being that you're losing the knight anyway, so maybe we can give the knight up and do as much damage as possible. So the move that I had in mind was knight takes f2, hitting the queen. It's a slightly risky move. Maybe white can go queen d4, but if king f2, then we go king g7, and we're groovy because we're up a pawn. And this is a useless check that merely helps our king get back to safety. Check, we can play f6, and we can try to trade the queens on the next move with queen b6. But still, you can see that these tactics are lurking even in seemingly like sterile positions. Anytime you have an undefended piece, you need to be aware of these types of tactics. But our opponent gives up the bishop, allowing us to ruin the structure, and the rest is very easy. Yeah, rook b8, get the rook into the game. We are never afraid that white castles queenside because the queenside is in shambles, so that was never a concern of mine. We just check on e5. If white would have gone king to d1, my response was rook to b8. The idea being that king c1 runs into rook takes b3. This is actually kind of an important detail because the rook on b2 is trapped, and king c1 actually is a very serious threat here. But how do I find the move rook to b8? Well, there's two reasons. First, it's the only piece that's not playing, so you should be intuitively kind of wanting to get the rook into the game. And the second, of course, is x-rays. Lateral x-rays are super important, like a rook x-raying the queen through a pawn, because that's what allows you to set up this type of tactic. If white moves the knight away, then the rook is now free, and you can go rook b1. If white plays queen c1, white drops the c3 pawn. So whichever way white moves, something is going to fall. Okay, that's basically it for this game. Once we won the pawn, the game is over. And all right, I think, let's see, last game. You guys have been a good chat. 4.5 hours. Last game. Let's do this. And we have the white pieces against a 999. Let's start out with e4, and hopefully we get another Gleck system. Looks like we will. Although, yeah, we will get another Gleck system. Excellent. Bishop to g2. And d6. So our opponent plays this properly. We respond with d3. And you might remember that in the previous speedrun episode, we faced the scary looking but ultimately futile knight g4, which simply runs into castles kingside. Bishop g4 is also a very common move. It's a natural move because black is developing the bishop and pinning the knight. And our response to this move is to play h3 and to ask the bishop a question. Where are you going to go? Because bishop takes knight simply gives us the bishop pair. Thank you very much. Bishop h5 is the better move, but now we can play the move g4 whenever we want to. We can play the move g4 on demand, which makes this pin a lot less scary. But playing g4 here is not the greatest idea. There's no reason for us to rush g4 because black's going to go bishop g6, and g4 is a very committal move. It weakens the f4 square. It's a move that we want to play if we have a very clear follow-up. But there's no rush to play g4, and so we can very safely castle kingside. Now, if black plays knight to d4, which is a super common response at this level, then g4 is a lot more attractive. Now g4 is a lot more attractive. Why is it a lot more attractive now that black has played knight d4? Well, there's a very specific reason. First of all, the pressure against our knight was kind of annoying. And the other way to disarm that pressure was bishop e3. But bishop e3 has no clear follow-up because we ourselves don't want to give away the bishop pair with bishop takes d4. It's a better idea to address this directly with g4. The other big reason is that we can bring our queen up to f3. You might say, well, why is the queen on f3 such a good piece? What is it doing here? Well, it's not doing anything when it operates alone, but we can bring out some of our teammates and start causing a little bit of a headache for black. What am I talking about? Bishop to g5. And bishop g5 is stronger than it usually is. Whoa. Because after h6, bishop h4, the bishop on g6 is preventing black from doing the same thing that we did and playing g5. Also, by the way, we could have taken the knight and gotten a Winter Capablanca situation. We could have gotten a Winter Capablanca situation, but there's a slight difference here, which doesn't make me want to go bishop f6. Queen e7 is a mistake. Black had to play c6 here. Black had to play c6 here to prevent knight to d5. Our opponent walks right into it, and we go knight d5, and black is in huge trouble because queen e6 blunders the queen. Very, very common. Queen e6, there we go. Classic tunnel vision at this level, where our opponent sees knight d5 and thinks, whatever black does, we're going to play knight takes f6. And forgets that there's actually other pawns that might be hanging. What is a Winter Capablanca situation? So Winter Capablanca situation is when you get a bishop of this sort, which is fully imprisoned essentially for the rest of the game. If you just look at this bishop, it cannot get out. It can't get out through g8 because of the pawn. It can't get out through this diagonal because we have a pawn chain, and it can't get out through that diagonal, obviously. So first of all, why do I call this a Winter Capablanca situation? Because the most famous game that features this particular theme is Winter Capablanca. Now, this is a game that some of you in the chat and on YouTube will have heard of because it's a very famous game and it's shown in a lot of like basic positional textbooks, but it's worth looking at these games many times. Okay, so just a moment here. This is not actually Lecco versus Elvis, but rather William Capablanca, 1919. And basically, it's a 4 knights, and very quickly you will see what the fuss is all about. c5 by Capablanca to prevent d4. Winter unsuspectingly plays knight d5, and this is the critical moment. Much like in our game, the way to deal with this type of situation is to play g5. Now, one detail that's not often mentioned when people show this game is that knight takes g5 would scare a lot of newer players off of g5. Who can tell me why knight takes g5 doesn't work? Who can tell me why this move is futile? It's because of knight takes d5, exactly. And the problem is that the bishop is undefended, so these types of moves are going to succumb to queen h4. If white takes the knight, then we take the knight and we're chilling because g5 is defended. White doesn't have this move because the bishop is controlling that square. And if white plays knight f3, well, we can do many different things, one of which is just to drop our own knight back to e7. So very important detail spotted by Capablanca. White trades on f6, and here we go. Bishop g4, bishop f3, and this is the Winter Capablanca situation. See a similarity? The bishop on g3 is totally imprisoned. White is essentially down a piece. And Capablanca wins the game by opening up the queen side, ripping it open, and eventually white just resigns because the bishop is not playing. You can look at the rest of the game on your own. If we go back to the speedrun game, why didn't I do this? Because this is a slightly different situation. Black, in this case, has this uncontested bishop on c5, and our own bishop is not exactly, God's gift to humanity. And I was worried that black would play the move h5, and it would be hard to keep this bishop imprisoned because the g4 pawn is much more of a target in this position than it is in the Capablanca game, partially because we can't play the move f3 because the king is pinned, and it's hard to get this bishop off of the diagonal. Maybe we could go knight a4, but that's a different story. And black is threatening to play takes and rook h4. So it's important not only to have the knowledge, but to be able to properly apply it. Sometimes there will be some similarities, but enough differences so that you can't just blindly follow what you know. That's why we played bishop h4. Now, black should have played c6. Probably we would have played knight a4, which is a very typical move in the Gleck, forcibly getting rid of this bishop. And maybe then we would have played the Capablanca move bishop f6. Like maybe if black plays a5, now bishop f6 makes a lot more sense because we're able to get this bishop off the board and maybe even play the move f4. So You can see that a lot depends on kind of the concrete particulars of the situation, but our opponent blunders knight d5. Probably black should play knight takes d5 here. There's just no other moves, and give up the queen for 2 pieces, but here the win is a matter of technique. We would have played c3 and started to prepare central expansion with d4. Black is actually powerless because queen d7 runs into bishop f6, and queen d8 runs into knight f6, and bishop f6 with a fork. So queen e7 is one of the worst moves in the position that doesn't directly blunder a piece. And knight d5, just a very typical tactical trick, but very, very powerful. And that is why we waited for black to play knight d4 to play g4. And by the way, knight takes g4 here. Now we could play hg, and this is not nearly as scary as the winter position, but we also can play knight takes d4. It's the same concept. Now you might say, well, what about e takes d4 hitting the knight? But after hg, the bishop is also hanging. And at the end of the day, we win a minor piece and live to tell the tale. So another concept that is worth filing away is this knight takes d4, opening up the direct attack on the knight. Okay, guys, I think this is a good spot to call it a day. I'm pretty fried. But our first 2 Gleck systems have been an unabashed success. Hope you guys enjoyed the speed run. Sorry for the mic cutout issues, and you enjoyed the stream. This was a longer one. I will be streaming tomorrow, but I will be playing the bullet brawl off stream at noon. So you're welcome to watch me on Lead Chess, but I will on chess.com, but I will not be streaming just because I want to maximize my chances of winning. But thanks, folks. This is really fun. Good match against Amin, and I'm going to send you over to Joe Bruin. Enjoy a stream, and I will be live tomorrow at some point, maybe in the evening. I'm also playing an OTB Blitz event.